between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 people probably don't have the dad that they think they do.
The right-wing men want women to be private property, but left-wing want women to be public property.
I remember observing as a child this phenomena, which was this concept of the Mrs. degree.
Yeah, I nodded so hard I just hit my head on the back of the sofa.
No. Gotta live in the real world, honey.
There's a misunderstanding of what patriarchy thinks of women.
Hi, I'm Christina Rhodes.
And I'm Tempest Rose.
We are 2 millennial women 4 decades in.
We're revisiting the culture that made us, with a little more hindsight.
And a lot less bullshit.
We've made our own rules.
Built our own spotlights.
And we're here to speak our minds without playing dumb.
And without playing nice. And today, we're going to tackle a big one.
Yep.
I think this may end up, not like isn't this episode, we'll break out into multiple ones, but I have a feeling we're going to revisit the topic of feminism.
Oh, yes. Like, this is part 1 of probably a million. It's not even possible, I think, in an hour to cover everything. No. So I think today we're going to try and talk specifically about what we thought feminism was, what the sort of culture of feminism that is unique, I think, to our time period, and then how specifically we feel about that. But I mean, who knows? We'll see where the thread takes us.
Indeed. And I think also, sort of in advance of this chat, I thought about, maybe I should, because I've considered myself a feminist my whole life, right? It was just like always like part of my world growing up. My mom was a feminist. My dad was a feminist. We were all feminists together. But I was thinking to myself, actually, like, I don't know that much academically around, what you would consider third wave feminism or second wave feminism or anything else. And I was going to do a bunch of research, but I thought maybe it's just a little bit more real to just be a normal person and just have a chat about what we think about it.
Yeah, totally. I definitely have come to the conclusion that, and I was very guilty of this myself, if you are a woman in our society who has the drive that, we should live outside traditional gender roles, that we believe that women should have choice, to be educated, to work and be in the world, and we want to have a sense of autonomy over our own bodies, then of course we're feminists, and therefore I don't need to think any more about it. You just sort of therefore intrinsically understand feminism because of the lifestyle that we have. And whilst I guess some of that is true, I have since learned that there's actually, who knew, a whole body of understanding and arguments and theories and literature. And it wasn't like I was unaware, of course, that there's a history of feminism and that there is a literature. But I think it's very on brand for feminism that it's not really taken seriously outside of this kind of niche idea. We are talking about half of the population who has had thoughts and opinions about the lives that we've led in all parts of the world, in every period of time, and that maybe that could be as interesting and as rich and varied and add to the cultural life as like somebody who's a man who wrote some thoughts down about something. But it's not. It's a niche topic.
Yeah, it's a special interest.
Yeah.
Special interest subject.
That I didn't even consider particularly worthy of looking at because, of course, I must have known in my guts all about it because am I not an empowered woman?
Yeah. Well, I think, but is that also not just taking it for granted a little bit? I feel like I've taken it for granted. I think my mom's generation, her mom's generation, not necessarily her mom in particular, but we're really pushing on to try and make changes that I think there's still a lot of change which needs to happen, a lot. But yeah, like you're talking about, I run my own business, you run your own business. There's things about we chose our husbands, we
have our own bank accounts.
We have our own bank accounts. In this country, we could get an abortion. There's things which you can do, which, I think maybe I take that for granted at least.
No, I think I did too. And I think people do, women do. And I guess not necessarily the topic for today, but I think feminism has got itself into a lot of problems. I can, speak most freely about kind of UK society or Western society because we don't know the history of our own movement. And so actually, you don't know the rights that have been fought and won unless you bother to go looking. I'm sure lots of people don't realize it wasn't until the late 90s that rape within marriage was legal. You know, not owning a bank account. I didn't know literally until a few months ago. And then I felt super embarrassed that I didn't know, but why would I? Women didn't have their own nationalities until relatively recently. You had the nationality of your father, and then when you married, your nationality was null and void, and your nationality was his nationality, your husband. When a woman's children, like women fought until relatively recently to have the rights over their own children. So if you have, I understood that your children belonged to the father. That's literally patriarchy.
Yeah.
But what I didn't realize is that if the father died, your husband, because that's the formal setup, the mother then didn't automatically have the rights to her own children. They belonged to the husband's family.
It's mad.
I was so shocked when I read that. I just didn't know.
Yeah. But again, because it seems so counterintuitive to what we have now. I mean, even in the courts, there's, and I think for very understandable reasons, previously in the UK, in our lifetime, they would favor the mother quite substantially. And again, for good reasons in most cases.
But they do still, yeah.
Yeah. But we just take it for granted that that's
the norm. Yeah, that's the way it's always been.
Yeah.
And we've only ever seen that be challenged. I had no idea that mothers had to fight, not even to be the default, but to be considered at all.
Which is also, it just seems so counterintuitive because obviously, like a child's father can be, certainly before DNA testing, a child's father can be faked, right? Versus it's much harder to fake what woman that child was attached to.
Yes.
Where that came from. And my dad was telling me there's some statistic that it's really high. I don't want to quote it exactly, but I want to say it's between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 people probably don't have the dad that they think they do.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the paternity tests that started to come out when all these DNA tests became really popular. They started to do more studies on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, that does seem high. And I suppose when you think about it, because I can just hear the manosphere going, yeah, we always knew women were a bunch of sluts. But there's also that thing of like, fertility was your job as a wife. And it was always the woman's fault, wasn't it? There was always something.
VIII?
Yeah, right. Hello. Yeah. If there were no children, that was the woman's fault, and there was something wrong with her, or she'd done something wrong. There was no understanding that actually there's a duality of process here. And so as a woman, you would be under immense pressure to produce children. And if you didn't, you could be divorced and you were destitute. Because again, what bank account would you have? What access to society would you have? Nothing. That's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and unfortunately, it still exists in obviously some horrible relationships here and everywhere. But yeah, it's really crazy. It's just crazy because I think in our world, it just, I can't even imagine the conversation where Pip would try and suggest that I not have a bank account. Would also be the moment the divorce papers came through.
It's wild. So to bring it back a little, you said that about your parents. So I'm interested in growing up. Were your parents very overtly feminist? Was it a concept in the household?
I mean, I think my mom was very overtly feminist. My parents met in San Francisco in the 70s and were both, quite progressive. And to be fair, I actually don't remember my dad saying I'm a feminist. I feel like I just assumed that he was, but also the version of feminism that I was raised with when I was in my parents' house was this concept that it was very simple. It was that equal pay for equal work, which again, I never really kind of, sort of tore apart at this or poked around that much in it. But, on the surface, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like who would not agree with the concept that if I do the same job as you, with the same education and the same level and everything else, that I should somehow make less money than you. It doesn't make any sense. So that was the version of feminism that we had. And that was just like intrinsic. And I was raised to think that all men who are worthy of my conversation should also be feminists. And if they're not a feminist, they're some sort of weird creature that you should not associate with. How about you?
Oh, I find my parents' relationship with feminism, in hindsight, hilarious because vocally, my parents were very negative about feminism.
Oh.
I can literally hear my father saying fusty old feminists because for his generation, which I guess would be second wave feminism, like I'm not going to tell you either. Yeah. Feminism had that strand of being like, no, like eschewing femininity. That wasn't the whole of the movement, but I think there was that, like he would have been around. That feminism of that time. His time had that element to it. And so I think he had this idea of like feminists are like women who just want to kill all like fun and joy from society and hate dressing up and hate glamour and hate fun and hate men. And then my mother, again, I can literally hear her voice in my head, was be like, oh, but I don't know why I give my mother this weird English accent because my mother is the most Italian person who anyone's ever met.
I loved meeting your mom recently, and I asked how long she had been here because her accent was so strong.
Yes.
To which the answer is what?
Oh, like 55 years or something. Yeah, my mother sounds like she arrived from Rome an hour ago and had previously never left the country. But anything women have wanted to do, they've just done. Which my mother has both enacted and lived entirely contrary to in multiple parts of her own life. And the really comedic thing about this to me, well, if that's the right word, but my parents, who had 3 girls, gave us the most feminist upbringing ever in the majority of ways, which I think is really funny. And again, it's this thing like what people say and what people do are not the same thing and sometimes are not even remotely related. And to give some examples about how my parents in practice were actually incredibly feminist, education was paramount in my house. My father read to us when we were little. That was one of the things that he really did. Well, both of my parents wanted us to have the best education possible. Schoolwork was important. Homework was important. Development of the mind, development of culture. If I'd wanted to come home and talk about boyfriends and relationships, my parents would have been horrified. Firstly, they were very traditional and don't want to fucking know anything about dating, boyfriends. This is your nightmare and we just do not want to deal with it. But in a way, like they never felt that was important to my future, to my sense of self. And they actively kind of, I think, would have been very judgmental of me had I brought the chat that I was having with my girlfriends home. I'd be like, oh, I met this guy. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And I do know people's parents who, and probably mothers more likely, who would have been like, oh, have you met a boy? Oh, tell me all about him. Oh my God, never in a million years would my mother have done that. She just would have thought it was ridiculous. My mother thinks women who cannot exist without men are pathetic. She thinks this desire of women to need to have a man around is disgusting and gross and critiques it constantly. My mother worked for the whole of my upbringing. She kept her own money. She ran her own shop at one time. My mother is incredibly gender non-conforming in her sense of self. She is not remotely girly. But in other ways, my parents, I guess, encouraged other forms of femininity like hostessing, being kind of that generosity, a very feminine kind of sense of the generous hostess who appreciates people's needs. I was taught how to dress, how to make conversation, how to hold myself. These are old school women's arts, really. And so, yeah, I always think that's like a really funny mix. And we were, sorry not to drone on about my childhood, but we were very lucky that there was no boy. Like I was supposed to be the boy. And I often wonder, had my parents had a son, which would have been me, whether all of that would have not necessarily gone out of the window, but they were both very traditional. The son would have probably have been the most important child. And actually me and my sisters were really lucky that there wasn't a brother.
So interesting. I feel like as it was the 3 of you, your mom almost had like a subversive version of feminism. Do you know what I mean? Like teaching you to play in the man's world, but also making sure you were educated and could, had a sense of self and could kind of steer your ship through that.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. And when talking about parental roles, and like we're super interested in how your family kind of structure was as well, because you have a brother, so again, different. But in often ways, my mother was the very kind of almost quite masculine figure in the house.
Mm.
And my father would have more, at times, would have more of a compassionate thing around like periods. Like my dad was the one who would stay up and bounce on our beds and get us hot water bottles and rub our tummies when we were having period pains. My mother would not have done any of that.
And neither of my parents did any of that. I'm sure they actually probably both would have been open to it, but I was not interested in having that kind of support. I think they, again, sort of met in this sort of hippie culture. They still were very much of that era. My mom was more of the kind of bra burning side, but she really wanted to get married to my dad. She really wanted to have a family. She really wanted to be a mom. I think they had slightly different viewpoints, apparently in 2020 hindsight, on how much career freedom my mom was going to be given. But at the same time, my mom, was a journalist who made not a lot of money, because journalists don't, particularly female journalists in the 70s. And my dad, made a lot more money. And so they wanted to have a family, sort of think through the logic of this, right? Is just a bit different. But I do remember when I was growing up, we lived for a little stint on the East Coast, and my parents were a bit like fish out of water there. They are very much like, they are very Californian through and through, both of them in slightly different ways, but they're both Californian. And that is a logical place for them to exist. Living in suburban Boston is not a place that makes sense for either one of my parents.
Is it that different?
It's like a night and day different. It's a completely different world.
Okay.
First of all, it's much more religious. It's very puritanical in like just thought process.
I didn't know that.
Oh my God, yeah. It's a really interesting thing. And particularly we lived actually in a small town that was just next door to another small town where my family had come over on one of the ships just after the Mayflower. So this is like OG Puritans.
Yeah.
And that culture is still there.
Really?
But also what's there was this concept of getting a Mrs. degree. And so I went to when we were there, I went to an all-girls private school. Again, education, very valued. Everyone who was sending their kids there, education was obviously valued. It was a really expensive school to go to. And it was a very academic school. But a lot of it was around testing into preparing for tests to get you into a good high school. And the high schools that we were going to were all feeder schools for the Ivy Leagues. And it was really interesting because I just remember observing as a child this phenomena, which was this concept of the Mrs. degree, which was sort of woven into the structure of my friends' lives. And that was this idea that you would go to Andover, or my brother went to Middlesex, but some of these other really traditional boarding schools that a lot of former presidents have been to. And that from there you would go to Yale or Harvard or yada, yada, yada. But the goal wasn't so that you could be this like super well-rounded individual in the future. The goal was so that you could get married. And that was like still the concept. And it was really interesting because it was just, then when I went to high school, we moved back to California, which like could not be any more different if it tried. And I think parents there would have been horrified by the concept of a Mrs. degree. I know one person who married their high school sweetheart out of all the people that I went to school with, but she still had a job and had interesting things and did an interesting life. But yeah. Did that exist here?
No. I think that's well, I've said no. I don't think it really exists.
Do you go to Oxbridge to get a...
Yeah, no. I probably dismissed it a little bit too quickly out of hand. I do think it's an American phenomenon. And that's the feminine mystique, some of that, isn't it? The idea of in the post-war period when their grandmothers and mothers had fought for education and the rights of education, girls started going to university purely to meet a wealthy, eligible husband. And that's where their interest in education stopped, and then a sort of return to the household. Yeah, it wasn't such a thing here. Yes, I'm sure it happens. I don't think it's an Oxford and Cambridge thing because you have to be actually genuinely really smart to go there. Or certainly previously you did. I'm sure people have critiques of it now. But
I think I'm just going to stop you there. But I think that's the thing is, so you'd still be the concept of this whole plan is you'd be going to Harvard or Yale, or you'd be going to the top universities in the country and arguably the world. Apart from Oxford, one part.
I feel offended by your insinuation. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't.
But that's why it was this weird thing. It was technically you're supporting your child and being really educated, and achieving great things, but really a lot of them had not always a subtle plan for their daughter to go there.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I suppose then the question, something about it, because you have this whole thing about Kate Middleton's mother pressured her to go to the same university and to take a year out as, which one did she marry?
Prince William?
Yes. Yes, that's him. It's a little like care about the royals. Yes, that way.
He's your royal.
I watched all of The Crown and I still can remember which one it is. So yes, I think there's that social climbing, middle class of a middle class thing. Upper class people don't have that because you have your sort of incestuous with a small I circles anyway. So your society is defined. So you don't need to meet somebody at university.
I think in my experience when I was growing up, this wasn't, maybe for some people it was about social climbing, but I think for a lot of them it was about social insulation and protection.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Same. But like, if you're upper class in this country, it's such a tight network, I think, anyway.
Yeah.
You don't need to go to university to do that. But definitely, I guess, if you are in the ambitious middle class and you go somewhere like Bristol or Edinburgh, those universities, Durham, that kind of shit. You're looking at me with a screwed up face.
No.
Have you not heard of these places?
No, I haven't.
Oh, yeah, fine. Well, I guess they're famous for not necessarily academia.
But there we go.
There we go. So coming into then our teenage years, like we are of the teenage time of Playboy, for example, which you talked about before, being a brand that actually was something that girls our age would wear. And it was a TV show. Is that our teenage time? Girls and Bunnies of the Playboy Mansion or whatever it is.
No, I worked with them. I shot a whole film with one of them that we turned into an episode.
Oh my God.
Like all about those girls with women. No, well, so that came later. So I think we produced that film when I must have been like, I don't know, 25, 26. This is a little bit later. But I wore a Playboy shirt when I was 16 to picture day because my friends and I had all made a pact that we would wear something controversial. And again, I think we'll also talk about this. There was this concept that as a woman, and particularly as like an educated woman who I think, had a high vision of myself, that associating yourself with a brand like Playboy was subversive and empowering in a way that I would not think so now. But my friends ain't chickened out or just made the right decision. And I wore it. My parents got called up. But my mom, was like, you know what? My daughter can wear a Playboy shirt, but she's not out doing drugs. And she, at least hard drugs, Mom. And she's, weed is just like part of the culture in Northern California. And she's not out drinking, which was true. So who cares, right? Who cares?
Yeah.
I don't care. So then I like blurted out on top of my photo.
That's so funny. Well, I guess, is that a nice segue into... You're definitely of the culture that fought back against this idea of like what you wear defines how you should be treated, particularly as a woman. And I have lots of critiques of our feminism, but I'm really like pleased with that element of it. Like what you wear is not consent. It doesn't indicate your sense of self-worth. And what I find really disturbing about that narrative is this whole like, you should dress in a way that shows that you respect yourself. And whilst I sort of understand the top layer of that, the bit underneath that never really gets explored, which is, okay, let's say you believe that if a woman dresses really trashily, then she has no self-respect, then surely the civilized way to treat her is with extra respect, not to think that, she's a piece of trash then that you can do whatever the fuck you want with. And the critique on that is always on the woman and how she dresses and not, in fact, your response to her as a man or as a society or whatever it is. If you genuinely believe that person is damaged and, the judgments that you make upon her, should you not show more care, like you say?
Completely. Or on like a much less egregious side, could you not say that not wearing makeup because it's probably better for your skin and your overall health and not, do you know what I mean? That you can still present yourself in a nice way, but you don't necessarily have to play into what our society considers somebody who's looking after themselves is. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I suppose I meant more like in terms of...
I know. Like as a side tangent.
Yeah,
a side tangent. And I would say...
What I would also say, though, to what you were speaking about,
is obviously like the real danger around. And I think this was a topic in a lot of court cases when we were growing up, is how much is what you're wearing responsible? Like, how much can that be if you're accosted, if you're assaulted, if you're harassed? How much is it your fault?
Yes.
Victim blaming because of what you're wearing. How much were you asking for it?
Yes. And so I actually hadn't really thought about it until we started talking now, but I am proud of, I think, the fact that it's in our sort of millennial age group, the huge pushback against that. And clearly we've not like resolved this completely, obviously, but that was a dialogue at the time that was super important. Like, no woman asks for it based on what she wears. And this whole construct of like, oh, you know, but you're in a short skirt, yada, 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 is absolutely fucking bullshit.
Yeah, completely. And I think there was, I'm not sure what it was like for you in your sort of teens and early 20s, but where I was in California, there was a really big move to kind of take back the word slut as well. And I also had it in my own life. I mean, I was called a slut I was bullied when I was 11 and 12. I was 5'8" by the time I was 11. I was 5'10" by the time I was 12. So pre-puberty, or like just when I was on the cusp. So I looked like an adult, and I got a lot of adult attention. I can't remember if I told you this, but when I went to Italy with my mom when I was 12 years old, she bought me a wedding ring because I literally was just getting harassed so much.
Wow.
And then it stopped, basically, just because, I don't know, whatever. Then I was like,
how funny.
Good. I know. But yeah, but I got a lot of attention. And with that came a lot of jealousy. And then with that came girls being the hideous bitches that they often can be, and got bullied for it a lot. So I had a lot of pain with that term. And one of my best friends knew that. But I also was a very sex positive person when I was in for most of my life. But so she would just call me slutty, right? That was like literally, I think in 3 years of basically living with Crystal, I don't think she called me anything other than slutty. And I didn't buy it. It was totally fine. And there were definitely some people who thought it was like fucking weird. But yeah, like nothing about it bothered me. But I do think it's this interesting thing to kind of drill into around with things like the kind of like taking back the word slut or dressing in really provocative ways. You know, I guess it's really just understanding around intent and purpose. Not that like I don't have a purpose by wearing this jumper and jeans today, apart from the fact that it was cold. But, but I think it like when you think about those things, it's important to just try to unpick, where are we taking back the narrative and doing something empowering? And where are we actually just feeding into like the horrible systems to be?
Yeah, I noted so hard. I just hit my head on the back of the sofa. Not in a hard way, but just because you can't see me. So I thought I would illustrate that for you. Yeah, yes, let's get into it. But it's hard to have a definitive line on, like, we'll have this discussion and I feel like you won't necessarily have like defined where that line is. Slut feminism, I think of, or raunch feminism, I've also heard people call that era, which is definitely that like, no, if you want to have sex, if you want to dress like whatever, if you want to work in the strip club, if you want to blah, 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 which is all to do with kind of like actually being, in some ways sex positive, in some ways getting rid of like various victim narratives, or kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like this idea, the good girl narrative. There we go.
Yeah.
And that's all really great. Like, that's great. But I have come to the conclusion, maybe I will change my mind at this end of this chat, that we then let that slide with no examination. And then younger generations sort of reaped, I guess like with the porn thing, reaped the rough end of that, actually. Our generation's reaction to everything that we had before us, and I guess all generations do that, and then therefore what we created after us, with no sense of overall, I don't know. Like, I know women who have been critiqueful of kind of raunch feminism. You were around at the time, so I don't know if you remember this act. I won't name her. I mean, she made the act, but she's not a performer now. So like our British burlesque performer, if you know about British burlesque, you'll probably remember her, created this whole women's liberation act, clowning burlesque piece, where she went through the different eras, and she literally ended in the 90s dressed as like a Spice Girl with a can of beer, sticking her fingers up and drinking and dressing really provocatively. In the end of the act, she unfurls this banner and it says "liberated?" And at the time, I love the act, and so I booked it a lot because I love acts to ask questions, but I think I have more appreciation for its message now than I did at the time. I probably found actually the sort of end of it a little bit like, I'm not really sure what you're trying to say here. But I think the conversation is worth having. So I loved the act. And an interesting thing I found about her backstage is now I look at her critique and I think it's very feminist in a radical feminist sense. But she once told me that she didn't think of herself as a feminist at all. She considers herself an equalist, which is a term that in honesty I find fucking ridiculous. And I haven't seen this person in years. She might look back on that and roll her eyes herself. But she was spot on with the question mark over, is treating sex like men treat sex, drinking like men drink, being fully sexualized at all times in a way that's actually very masculine, is that liberation for women? It's the question.
Yeah, completely. Because I would also argue that performers like the Spice Girls who were marketed towards pre-teens and teenagers, it's not that they were doing anything that defied the concept of what a heterosexual man was looking for. Do you know what I mean? Like if it had maybe been more 100%. Like size positive or varied or race varied or like a million other things, then fine. But in fact, you actually had what were really kind of stereotypical versions of what a woman could be. She can be posh and slutty. She can be, and I love you, Posh Spice, so much. But that's it.
But it's always slutty, isn't it? She could be sporty, but slutty.
Yeah,
she could be
all of it.
Different ethnicities, but slutty.
Yeah,
or like the one black woman Scary Spice. But slutty.
Yeah, exactly.
And if she was slutty, then it was empowerment.
Yeah, it was so interesting because I think you have to kind of like stray away. And I remember that performer, and I totally agree with your sentiment too. I think watching it, I loved it, but there was also something around me that was like, but
yeah, what do you say?
What do you say? Yeah, exactly. I also remember, I don't know how much that came into your world, but there was a group called the Suicide Girls.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, if you are a suicide girl, were a suicide girl, and I get some of these facts wrong, I do apologize. But from my memory, it, sort of portrayed itself. And I think it also speaks to the relationship I was in at the time, which was not, an overly positive one. But he was somebody who saw the Suicide Girls as really empowered, right? And presented this in this way to me. And, and I even looked into posing with them, which I'm grateful I did not. But it was this website, which was owned by a man and basically women who were not part of the, again, sort of, they didn't look like a Spice Girl, right? They're usually covered in tattoos, a little bit alternative, but again, still usually white, skinny, large-chested, very young, often a lot of stuff that played with the kind of Lolita edge to it too. Yeah, exactly. Like veering into pedophilia. But it had all that stuff. So it wasn't actually subversive apart from the fact that they were covered in tattoos. And then you could pay to do your own shoots, or I think in the beginning they would pay you something to basically be a nude model, right? Like as if you were posing for Playboy, but somehow because you were covered in tattoos, it was then empowering as opposed to, I suppose maybe we all sort of thought of Playboy, it was like having a resurgence as well. But it's just really interesting. And then it did kind of explode because people started to look a little bit at the fact that the person who was making the most amount of money from this was a man. And then I think some of them went off to go do their own thing. But again, it was really part of this whole, raunch feminism for sure.
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion, because you've hit the nail on the head, I think, for me, like what one of the biggest problems of this whole movement is, and having done in the last couple of years a little bit more like reading and deep thinking, I think there's this confusion amongst some women, especially liberal women. This is what liberal feminism is. And I think to clarify, the problem with the term liberal feminism is like the suffragettes were liberal feminists. It's based on this idea that like women are autonomous human beings who deserve dignity and respect as individuals. I know, wild. And so therefore their argument was maybe should be allowed to vote or have protections under the law. Or tick, tick, tick.
Not be raped by our husbands?
Exactly.
Oh, wait, it took to the 90s.
Yeah, we'll get right on that, ladies. Yeah. I'm just a little bit busy. Don't worry, we'll be right there. Yeah, so like classical liberal feminism, great. Modern liberal feminism, so some people call that like lib fem, or I guess you could call it like neoliberal feminism, is for me very tied up in this whole like, it's empowering to be slutty, it's empowering to this, that, and the other. And I've come to the conclusion, well, this is what I will present to you. You can see whether you agree. There's a misunderstanding of what patriarchy thinks of women. And I think our generation labored under the delusion that patriarchy was about purity. Because I guess maybe when we thought of like traditional like right-wing roles for women, it was all very chaste and women were almost just like sexless creatures. And you had this whole Madonna whore thing going on. And it's that like the good woman was pure and chaste. And that's what patriarchy wanted for women. And so I think we sort of felt like, yeah, that's not true. Fuck you. But that's actually not what patriarchy says about women and has said about women in huge kind of incarnations. The idea actually is that women's sexuality is so raunchy and out of control and base that it needs to be controlled by what you wear, by your father, by your husband. It's not that women aren't sexual. It's that we are so sexual that we're almost like the witches held orgies with the devil and they were having sex with goats and each other. And, you know, women were of the body and of nature because of childbirth, and men were rational and of the mind and were intellectual. And we were like subject to our emotions, subject to our desires. So,
hysteria.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, patriarchy's view of women is that we are sex mad kind of irrational creatures that need to be controlled. So unfortunately, being like, yeah, guess what? I like to fuck actually isn't really bucking the system in the way that I felt we were all conditioned to believe.
Yeah.
Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I've actually never thought about it like that. And I think it's a really good point. I mean, I guess the sort of counter would be that I sort of still grew up in this culture that you were supposed to be like, that is absolutely true, but you were still supposed to follow these certain rules. It doesn't negate what you're saying at all. But yeah, it's such an interesting view on it. And why did nobody think about this in the 90s and early 2000s?
Oh, God. Well, because it's all feminism through the lens of like patriarchy, misogyny, isn't it? Which we still have today. And so I guess my critique is when there was this whole like, yeah, women like sex too. Ha ha. Bet that throws a spanner in your works. Like, spoiler alert, it doesn't. What would have, which did happen a little, was what needed to happen, I think, was that sex. And so that's what I mean by sexuality would be reframed from a woman's perspective. And like some of that did happen. We did have sex positive movements. There was like, I feel like the language around orgasm has changed massively. So certainly when I was young, there was this like, oh, did he make you come type thing? And then it was like, no, there's this whole 80s, like women are responsible for their own orgasms. Yeah, we don't need no man and sex toys and dildos. Yeah. And I suppose it was an attempt to try and reframe sex through a woman's perspective. But raunch feminism and slut feminism in the main, I don't think did that. We never had, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, discussions around actually what pleasure meant for women, what sex meant that wasn't just penetrative sex, penis and vagina sex. I mean, maybe some people could say that's happening more now, and I think that's great. But like this idea that like sex isn't just defined by sex that gives men the most pleasure. Like there's definitely the idea like sex finished when the man orgasmed. And you might have orgasmed before, or maybe you did after, but that is the sort of, foreplay is the other stuff, which doesn't involve the penis and the vagina. The penis and the vagina is the main course scenario, and then that sort of has to happen until the man comes, and if he doesn't, maybe something's gone a bit wrong there. Like, we never really had raunch feminism, I think, sort to have an honest discussion about what sex might look like or should be like, as understood by half of the population. But it didn't, I don't think.
No, totally. But also, if you are going to start to put things on their head, then, you know, arguably paying to see naked photos of somebody, also sometimes dressed in a kind of Lolita way, which is what the Suicide Girls was, is not subversive. This is not, this is exactly the same thing as it has been before.
Since forever.
Yeah, so like there's nothing about this which is different.
Yeah, I've got to say I am totally lost, and I've thought about it so long of this idea that like making sex transactional is subversive. Sex has been transactional, enshrined into our institutions since like Greek and Roman times and probably before.
Well, you pointed out the other day when we were chatting about this that, you know, there's a very common phrase which a lot of people take for granted, which is that the oldest industry is prostitution. And it's like, as you pointed out, that is not true. But that's what that's like very much people just like, yep.
We just take that for granted.
Yep. Obviously, sex has been transactional forever.
Yes, since the birth of time.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could do a whole episode on that too. That's not true. But the fact that, like you say, that people are so willing, like for me, that's just like, that really shows the conditioning, how deep that goes, to see ourselves as commodities. The fact that that is just accepted with no critique, with no logic, with no knowledge of history. But, you know, within the context of raunch feminism, again, it's like we felt that these things were kind of like empowering or taking back control of a narrative, but it's just the same old dynamics that have gone on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, and also, like, to your point, when somebody says that prostitution is the oldest, you know, job in the book, they're not usually talking about men. So it's not like, again, we're sort of like reversing the roles and we're thinking, allowing everybody to feel like sex is a commodity for everyone. That's not what is in people's minds.
Yes.
What do you think about just switching gears for a minute, you know, we have a friend who is mentioning to us that they don't see themselves as a feminist because they feel that they see themselves as an ally to women, but that they don't see themselves as a feminist because that feels like that is a woman's movement, and it is almost like as a man, it's sort of like taking something that belongs to women. What's your take on that?
Honestly, I don't know. I sort of can understand both. If a man says to me he's a feminist, I wouldn't immediately think that's impossible, you're a man. I do think that there is a culture of men saying they're feminists on the left or in progressive circles and being some of the biggest regressive misogynists out there. So I will probably be suspicious in that way, not because I think it's impossible for a man to be a feminist, but then, yeah, like, I do understand our friends and other women who are like, no, men can be feminist allies. They cannot be feminists. Only women can be feminists. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it took me by surprise because, again, I just sort of like take for granted that most men that I would ever speak to consider themselves feminists. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting point that I'd never really thought about, but just interesting. But going back to something you just said there, what do you mean that you think that some men on the left are call themselves feminists, but in fact are not?
It has been pointed out to me, and when I first heard discussions around this, like, my mind just like exploded. It's like
mine too when you told me, which is why I want you to share this.
So I have always sort of, without question, accepted this idea that, like, I live in a very kind of liberal, progressive pocket, and anyone who wants to control women and is anti-feminist, like, that's a right-wing thing. And it's all about, like, taking away women's bodily autonomy, getting women back into the home, like your wife, and you own your wife, and all of that stuff that's how we thought our enemy was, essentially. And so I felt like my whole world perspective shifted when it pointed out to me, well, there's actually a left-wing version of misogyny, kind of anti-feminism as well. And that's men on the left. Their feminism extends to things that service them and their penises, essentially. So when a lot of left-wing feminists, who are men, talk about feminism, they talk about abortion rights, they talk about reproduction rights, being able to work in pornography if they want, sell sex if you want, which are all things that benefit men. and benefit men's access to fucking women, or looking at pictures of women and videos that they can jack off to. It's all still women in service of men and male sexuality. And I have never once heard, and this was kind of proposed to me, I've never once heard a male feminist on the left talk about wages for housework, policies that would mean that new mothers aren't extra vulnerable to abuse in the home because they are in a state where they cannot work, where they are vulnerable because of the baby. And they might hear a little bit of noise here and there about gender pay gap, but nothing really major. Like policies that are to do with women's autonomy and women's safety that don't directly benefit men. Is that what I said last time?
Yeah. Yeah. Which I just thought was really interesting when you put it like that. And that's not to say that, in my opinion, that the men in my life whom I love and care about, and I'm sure, well, I'd imagine the same for you, don't care about those things. I don't feel like, all men are evil and trying to like pull away all women's rights. But I do think that you raise a very interesting point.
Yeah. And I think the danger for me is not, as you say, that like every single man, well, sometimes it can feel like that, but it's not the case that you and I think every single man has some kind of horrible misogynistic agenda. Yeah. But I do think it's true, and I have been guilty of this, that there is a sort of assumption that men in circles that are artsy, that are left-wing, that are progressive, are somehow immune to misogynistic or patriarchal mindsets, and that also that we are too. And I see this day in, day out. I am surrounded by a culture that never questions what their own side does and whether or not it actually benefits women or not, and actively actually wants to suppress even a dialogue about that. And so I see a lot of women enacting patriarchy, but not realizing it. I find that really disturbing. And I think it comes from this idea that like misogyny is over there. That is a right-wing issue. We can see it. We know what it is. And this is the safe space over here. And I can appreciate that's a scary thought for women, that actually, sorry, you're not even safe within the little pocket that you exist in. But please start, I don't want to like unsettle you, but please start analyzing, actually, stop making that assumption. It is not the case that all misogyny is a right-wing issue.
No, completely. But I mean, I also would imagine, unfortunately, that if, let's suppose you take the entire left-wing side of this country or probably any other, lots of women are still going to be in abusive relationships. Lots of women will have, partners who are, operating with coercive control. Lots of them are going to be in situations that do make them vulnerable. And that's just, do you know what I mean? That's not like right-wing territory.
No, of course. I agree with that 100%. I think that women would recognize that, but a lot of women haven't quite clocked it's bigger than one-to-one relationships. It's the whole cultural kind of dynamic. Yeah. Andrea Dworkin has this thing of like public and private property. Again, I'd like never heard of this until a few months ago, and I was just like, oh my God. And like maybe, I'm sure to somebody who's super well versed in this stuff, I'm going to do like a hatchet job of explaining. But my understanding is, her theory is like the right-wing men want women to be private property, but left-wing, and I hate using left and right, but it's a shorthand, like you guys sort of know what I mean when I say that, want women to be public property. So you can you can be treated like shit by one guy, or you can be treated like shit by lots of guys. Pick your poison.
It's very depressing, Tempest. Very depressing.
It is a bit, yeah.
I really feel like with so much of this, though, what I wish I felt like there was a clear understanding for was sort of what to do next, right? So I have a niece and nephew. I'm going to go see them later tonight. Love them to bits and pieces. And they're 8 and 12 right now. They're the closest I'm going to get to having my own children. And you just think, like, where does all this come from? Like, what is the wave of feminism that's happening right now? Because I would say that raunch feminism and, well, feminism in general, that word started to appear probably before I was 8. And then it was starting to be in, the thought process and in our psyche. And so what is it now? And how do we help kind of move that narrative to something that's less horrendous?
I mean, honestly, I cannot answer you because I'm increasingly of the opinion that modern feminism all needs to go in the bin. Sorry. I actually think it's rotten to its core. And I need to sort of have a deeper thought on that. So sorry, that's just a spoiler for an episode to come because I haven't got enough to be able to articulate succinctly that's not us just waffling for like the next 7 million hours. So I don't know, but it's a really important conversation. I'm like here to hear about it and here to learn more about it. So I suppose like something I've got on my list for us to talk about today, so maybe this is a natural segue from that, is do you have thoughts on parents who want to bring their children outside of gender roles? Not necessarily that they want to raise their children as non-binary, but they're trying to kind of like raise their children as gender neutral. There we go. That's the term I'm looking for.
What an interesting question. So I'm not sure, just to put it out there, I'm not sure how eloquent I'm going to be on this. I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but if it's what I think you're referring to, I don't believe and was also raised to not believe in gender conforming roles. So again, it's not the only part of me that's gender non-conforming, but I run a business, I make money, I have my own bank account. I was always raised that those things were positive things to do and that that's what my life should look like. And I should have a relationship with somebody who supports me in doing all those things and not trying to take them away. But when it comes to raising children to have gender non-conforming roles, that I would fully support that. But I also don't think that that's, I think, teaching a child to be resilient and to sort of study and to be kind, but to hold your own space and be strong. All of those are things which every child should learn. And I think the concept in this day and age that any of that should go into a gender or a non-gender is lunacy to me. Does that answer the question? Maybe you should give more like background on what you're actually talking about.
So I've come across parents, and I should really say probably through friends of friends. I think the parents I know are doing, I guess what you described was in your upbringing, like not trying to limit their children based on their sex, like trying to teach what they consider core values to their children, regardless of the sex of their children, all of which like I super applaud, like, of course. That I free friends of friends, which makes it sound like I made it up. A friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. No, this is a thing, and you all know it's a thing. Don't even look at me like that. I'm like, no, we're going to bring our children up like without the concept of gender at all. And I find this quite unusual because,
no, I guess it's like telling your child the blue is red.
Right.
You got to live in the real world, honey. Right. They're going to have to live in the real world.
Right. And the thing that I find a little odd about this, but look, I would love to hear more. Firstly, I actually don't think all gender roles are negative. I think we encounter and we talk a lot about negative gender stereotyping, and we should. But gender roles are varied and huge and societal, and not all of them are negative at all. Often they're born out of the sort of reality of life. And secondly, when I hear about these parents, what I tend to hear revolves around what toys they play with and how they dress. And I'm sorry, but that is the most superficial end of gender. I actually think it's really hard to get to the nitty-gritty of what are gendered expectations. And that goes much, much deeper about like whether you let your girl play with trucks, whether you teach your boy that he should care about other people's feelings. And so I'm genuinely quite fascinated by this concept. And I didn't know whether you encountered it. I would love to know more about this because these things are so deeply ingrained in our society that I think it's almost impossible to unpack them. So when parents say that they're doing this, I really want to know, again, beyond hobbies.
I think it's an interesting one because I think hearing you say it, my first reaction is like, oh my God. Because yeah, it sounds so superficial. Like those are absolutely, I guess what I was trying to say and just not articulating well is that in my mind, every girl should be able to play with trucks. Every boy should be able to play with dolls. Like this should not be a drama. If somebody wants to wear a dress, let them. If somebody wants to wear trousers, let them. Like that does not make up your sex. And in my opinion, it does not make up your gender. Those are just personality traits, right? And like special interests. Some kids like pink, some like black, some, who cares, right?
Totally.
And what does it matter? But what I would say is I do wonder if there is an argument also for the fact that if you do look at the real world and the world that we live in, and, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, I've seen in my niece and nephew certain traits coming out certain behavioral traits coming out in both of them that feel quite historically gender confirming. And I find it quite disturbing because I consider both my brother and his ex-wife to be, pretty like progressive people. They go to a very progressive school. So I don't understand where these things are coming from. And arguably, you could say some of its nature. I don't agree with the particular things we're talking about. I don't think that's true. So I guess if I was a parent and I'm looking at this situation being like, I don't know how this is seeping in so early already, then maybe I might be like, well, with the tools available to me, which are the superficial tools, or at least some of them, then I will make really specific choices to try to combat what is clearly just kind of like all around them still. Maybe that's an argument for it.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just being really cynical. I'm just like, yeah, you can do all the things that you've said. And I applaud them again. Like, I agree with what you said. But the notion that unless you've done some kind of specialist deep dive into all of the minutiae of how gender seeps in, it's very unlikely to me that parents will genuinely be raising their children, because so much of it is completely subconscious. So much of it we don't even understand ourselves. Like, and again, I hadn't really super thought about it. Femininity. Oh, well, it's feminine dress. Maybe it's being soft. It's being empathetic. It's being, like sort of like a lot of it's to do with aesthetic and some of it's to do with a kind of performative behavior. And like for me, well, I've come to learn actually this isn't a super widespread opinion. I just assumed it was. Femininity is a social construct. Yeah. Femininity is a role that society conditions us into playing. And a lot of it goes against the natural nature of being a woman. Childbirth is not dainty. Like, period pain is not meek and mild. And so actually there are traits of feminine conditioning such as conformity that I guess that I really want to ask parents who do this, right? Like, how do you combat testosterone? How do you combat your daughter's desire to want to fit in with all of her friends due to the need of group safety? Like, there are lots and lots of elements to both masculinity and femininity that go well beneath, I think, what we sort of popular culture throw around as like, oh, toys and trucks and being loud or being quiet or being bookish or being into science, And not to say that you shouldn't bother to make an effort.
No, completely. I mean, I do imagine that there's such important questions, but I mean, like, again, unless you're a child psychologist, it's a lot, right? Like, it's a lot to unpack.
It's a specialist subject.
Yeah, and try and figure out how do you do that? When it's also like, you have, as a parent, your child for however many hours that they're at home with you, hopefully off their screen if you're in my camp, but they're around you for this sort of limited period. And then they're off to school where you don't know what they're encountering and you don't know who they're encountering and what concepts and ideas and, words are being spewed and what other people's parents believe and, like everything around them, right? The TV shows they watch, the YouTube channels they see. You only get this, like, I think nowadays you get this limited window with your kid where you can make an impression and kind of have a level of control over what their world looks like, in a way that maybe our parents could control it a little bit more. But I completely agree with you around the word femininity and the concept of it. It's just such a shame because I wish that there was a word that almost, again, kind of going back to the beginning of this episode, that we kind of reclaim that didn't feel like it's just going back into all of the societal constructs that I don't agree with, but that you can still take pride in being a woman and all the like hard things about it and some of the good things that come with it. Do you know what I mean?
Do you think?
Versus femininity feels like, I mean, what other word is there? I guess like womanhood. But what other word can you use to describe being a woman? Womanly?
No, woman. Well, some people say womanhood, I guess. The difference between like womanhood and femininity. And like, I think, you and I both enjoy lots of parts of femininity. Yeah. I don't think all of femininity is bad at all. I think some of it's great. I think it's really interesting that you and I can be quite hyper in some of our expressions of femininity, but are actually very gender non-conforming. And I think sometimes people misunderstand those two things as well. They think if you don't dress a certain way or talk a certain way, that you are not conforming to femininity. And you might not be conforming to the aesthetic of femininity, but femininity is also to do with how we behave around each other, how we view ourselves. And so yeah. And then I know a lot of people who are the inversion of us, who might assume, some of the beautiful fashion that you and I love, like makeup, presentation, being hostessy sometimes. You and I know how to do that kind of performative hostess role very well when we need to. And, I can't speak for you, I really enjoy it. When I'm in the mood for it, I really enjoy it. Probably because I've been conditioned into it from birth. And I know some people who assume all of that, but when it comes to like some of the darker elements of femininity, and I suppose we've talked about the symptoms, I guess, of feminine conditioning, being passive aggressive, being totally dominated by relationships, outcasting women who don't agree with you, demonizing women that show individuality. These are all the negative sides of feminine conditioning. And I see that in a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily physically present as very feminine.
Yeah, that's a good point. So much to digest here.
Yeah, it's certainly not easy. What do you, so I've did a complete change of tack.
Yeah.
Or is it? When we did our adulting episode, I guess we don't know yet which order you lovely people will be listening to this episode in, but we have recorded this episode prior to recording today's episode. Adulting, we didn't talk about self-care. And I thought, I'm going to put this in actually feminism, because self-care, a thing that's become a thing in kind of the zeitgeist in the last, 10, 15 years?
Is that long? Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah, which I think is very feminine coded. Have you ever had thoughts on self-care? What does it mean to you?
What an interesting question. I don't think I've explored the concept of self-care in any level of academic approach.
No, I haven't either. Yeah. This is just based on popular culture and instinctual reaction.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess I really never thought about it. I think when I think about it, my gut instinct is when I think about self-care, it's the concept of taking time and space for yourself. So very self-focused activity. And is around, trying to sort of rebalance yourself towards a feeling of greater wellness. So
okay. Yeah.
When I think about that kind of self-care, I'm not sure where the connection to feminism is, but I'm curious to hear what you think, because clearly you have an opinion.
I've been thinking about self-care on and off for a couple of years. No longer than that, actually, because it came up on Ginsel, I'm sure. And out of interest, so you've been in therapy before, which you mentioned on here. Has a therapist ever talked about self-care with you?
The only time that I can think of any of my therapists, of which there have been many, talking about self-care was one experience more recently with a therapist whom I loved, who I was going through a really difficult period. And she, just said, obviously, I would consider myself somewhat of a high achiever. I'm definitely a workaholic. And she was like, if you are feeling totally overwhelmed and you're having a bad day, it is okay to sometimes just give yourself permission to just sit inside of that emotion. Just be like, you know what? Today is going to be a wallow day. And I'm just going to sit and I'm going to wallow. Now, I think she gave this advice to me in the contextual understanding of the fact that I usually work anywhere between 50 and 80 hours a week and work almost every week of the year. And do you know what I mean? This is not something where I'm settling to turn a switch and then, send in a month worth of mental health days. But sometimes I wish that I could.
To yourself.
Exactly. To myself and my own business. Dear Christina. So there was that. And then there was also, I had a really horrible experience where I went to see a therapist when I first moved to New York. And I don't even remember why specifically I think I was going to see him. Maybe it was to do with, some level of depression or something I was struggling with. That would make the most sense. But his suggestion for self-care was that I needed to get more in touch with my sensual self.
Oh my God, I knew you were going to say something to do with sex.
Which, if anyone who knows me, I may have lots of issues and I may be a very imperfect human. My connection to my sensual side is not where we're going wrong. Not the problem. And that actually that we should play role play, me trying to seduce him.
Stop it.
And I was so traumatized by the experience that and again, I have been through lots of therapy. I've had, unfortunately, lots of horrible situations with stupid men in my life. But I didn't talk about it until I went to see a different couples counselor with my ex-husband, who did actually want to, he's like, I want his name because I want to report him.
Yes.
I work for the board of, I don't know, whatever, like board approves therapists in New York City, and he should be disbarred.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's awful.
Yeah, it was really horrible. But again, that was this concept of self-care. What I needed for my self-care was to seduce him. Honey, that is not what I need.
Oh my God. Did this other therapist report him?
Yeah, he did.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, he was also a bad therapist for other reasons, but not for like disbarring reasons. He was just dismissive
of the sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm so interested in, which I super agree with. So the first therapist, this idea of like needing to her advice.
Yeah.
Do you know why you hadn't previously been kind of, I guess, giving yourself space to, like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, which is why I'm struggling to ask the question. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I would say that I am partly conditioned to take care of other people first, to prioritize other people, that I have sometimes like a low standard for what I need and what space I need and what's important, most important to me, as opposed to what's most important for other people.
Yeah.
And that like boundary is something that I have struggled with. And again, so I don't think that you would necessarily give the same advice to somebody who is on their like 14th day of calling in sick on mental health days. Do you know what I mean? But like in my context, this made sense.
Yeah. No, and like it's great advice, and that kind of putting everyone before your own needs, not valuing yourself enough to know that it's fine to take time. Like in the self-care context, when it comes particularly to women, because I think that's our conditioning, I really applaud that. I find the concept of self-care fascinating, because I guess there's that, which seems really commonsensical and important. There's internet culture self-care, which is like self-care is taking a bubble bath. Self-care is having a hot chocolate. Self-care, someone literally said to me once, oh, self-care is paying your bills on time.
What?
I was so like...
Oh, that's being an adult.
Right,
being responsible. That's not getting evicted.
Yeah, I was so taken aback by it, because in my head, I said exactly the same as you just said now. And I just didn't really know what to say. The idea, like...
It's so infantilizing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, this is my problem with some of self-care culture. And this is why I think there's a feminine element to it. It's self-infantilizing. And so I'm starting to wonder, because I've thought, as I know you have, this idea, like, how do we deprogram from a lot of this? And women have to stop self-infantilizing, firstly. But whether there's actually this form of like radical self-care. Have you ever heard this? I'm not saying I invented it, but it's about like, look, if you're in a situation whereby you are being overwhelmed by your commitments, whether that's through work, whether that's
every day of my life.
Every day of my life. Like, you know, women are often primary caregivers, whether it's to children, whether it's to other people in the family, whether you're being used as the primary emotional resource for the people around you. It can feel that you're like, give. Sometimes I feel that the narrative for those people that they should take some time out for themselves to kind of replenish their cup gets used by people who actually don't necessarily have all of these burdens in their lives, and who like to make a big performative gesture about like, oh, today I did something that I feel like you and I would just feel was sort of part of being a responsible adult. And so, you know, you need some kind of treat. And this kind of treat culture, I think, again, is part of this like self-infantilization. Right? Oh my fucking God, I can't bear self-infantilization. But I'm not just here to have a moan. And I do wonder, like, I would love to see the concept, especially for young people, because again, we've talked about this idea of like, you're in a time in your life where you actually can devote time to yourself. for a lot of young people. I know that a lot of young people can be carers and have other burdens placed upon them. But compared to adulthood, whereby actually I would love to see this idea of self-care for young girls is learning about money.
Mm-hmm.
It's investing in your cultural development, i.e. like art, creating things. Do you know how a pension works?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how mortgages work? Can you gain another skill that will mean that you can be more financially secure, where you don't have to rely on a boyfriend, a partner, or your parents? This idea that actually self-care, if self-care means investing in your well-being and in your future, then I'd love to see a more normalization of not bubble baths, but learning about things that are going to make you a more rounded person, are going to develop your mind, and are going to make you more financially secure.
I think it's a lovely idea, Tempest, and I fully support it. I mean, the whole concept of like having a bubble bath for self-care feels very like you're a mom in 1990. Like it feels very antiquated. Like, do you know what I mean? Just like you're like there's like you probably also work a job, right? But you then also, like you said, are probably the primary caregiver, and it's just like...
But like, I get it for those women. You work all day, you come home, you pick up all the childcare, having half an hour to yourself to just shut the fucking door and pretend that nobody else exists is really important.
Yeah.
But if you've just sort of worked from 9 till 5... Anyway, like, this is the generational difference, I think, of what we were brought up with as a normal level of stress, and then how we feel some young people feel like is what they think is being overburdened by responsibility versus what we feel.
Yeah. I mean, I also feel like even running business is fucking hard work, and I don't actually recommend it to anyone who's not like absolutely passionate about what they are trying to do. But yeah, I mean, like I still feel, even though I shoulder, as you do, the responsibility of payroll and bills and HMRC and VAT and yada, 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 and client expectations and keeping the wheels on the bus, I still don't feel like I have a leg to stand on because I don't have children. Like, and that's so like the concept that you could think that you need to take a bubble bath and like tell other people they need to take a bubble bath if you are not dealing with those things is totally mind-boggling to me.
Self-infantilization.
I didn't see how we were going to get to self-care connecting to feminism, but you brought us there.
But I did it.
You did it. Well done. Gold star for Tempest Road.
Can I have a treat now, please?
Yes.
Take a
roll over.
I'll have a biscuit.
A little chocolate chip cookie.
A little hot chocolate. I've been a good girl.
Oh, little tiny whitey break for you.
I know. Good girl, Tempest. Well, maybe that's a natural pause. Like, you and I could talk about this for literally like 700 years, but the clock tells me that we have reached a good innings. But like, is there anything else that you have a desire to discuss in this episode?
I don't think so. I think there's lots of little nuggets that we can pick up on in future episodes. So, yeah.
Definitely. And lots of experiences, I think, that you and I have had that we haven't even gone into yet.
Yeah.
Which...
Save it for the next time.
Yeah. There you go.
See you
all right,
guys
everybody. As always, let us know what you think.
Yeah.
Love to hear your thoughts, comments, treats.
I still like hot chocolate, for the record. But I do agree with you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.